March is Women's History Month, and we're seeing women make strides in closing gender gaps in leadership. In 2025, 30% of U.S. company board seats were held by women, 34% on average in the EU, and about 20% across Asian countries. However, we also saw only 1.3% of all U.S. and European venture capital funding go to companies founded by all women in 2025. How do we celebrate and acknowledge this progress while continuing to make strides towards advancement? Gender lens investing may be an option, but you might ask, what does it mean, and how does one start? We're going to break all that down and more here on UBS Trending. Hi everyone, and welcome to UBS Trending. I'm Tiffany Agard, filling in for Anthony Pastore. Thanks so much for joining us today. Our guest today is a dear colleague of mine, Amantia Muhudini, Head, Sustainable and Impact Investing Americas in Global Investment Management. Hi Amantia, thanks so much for joining me in this conversation on gender lens investment as we celebrate Women's History Month and the recent paper that the team published on gender lens investing. Maybe just to sort of start simply, what was the motivation to write this paper this year?
Yeah, of course. It's such a pleasure to be here, Tiffany, and to really mark Women's History Month with this paper and this conversation. I see this celebratory month just really as a way to take pause, take stock, think about where we are and where we're going. So in that spirit, we wrote this global paper with colleagues from really around the world in order to start answering some questions that we've been hearing a lot on our Global Investment Management SI team. A lot of conversations we have and conversations we have internally point to the statistics that you opened with. But then really we note that often individuals are saying, what does it actually mean to invest in this way? Does investment capital even have a role here? What does performance look like? Where do I get started? Lots of questions. And those questions really motivated the report this year.
Yeah, that's great. And sort of to that point, as we're thinking around gender lens investment, sort of all of the questions that you're getting, it seems like it makes sense to even sort of take a step back and think through why take this gender lens investing approach and sort of what are the objectives and outcomes that you're hoping to get into before diving right into product selection and sort of building out this portfolio. So it'd be helpful if maybe you could touch on a bit more around why starting with the why, I guess, is helpful as we're engaging in this framework.
Yeah, of course, starting with the why, as you say, is really important. Look, number one, this is an educational piece. And as we're thinking about education here, what we find is that it's important for anyone to be clear about the objective, the destination where they want to go in order to pick the right road to get there. So you can think of lots of other analogies here, but really our core reflection was that if you're not clear at the starting point on what you want to achieve, you may not end up in the right destination, and then you wouldn't have known why. When we use the term gender lens investing, really, what does this refer to? We're thinking about investment strategies that deliberately are thinking about the role of gender, so men and women, in how they come together and think about where capital is going and what is it supporting. But we find that often investors, individuals, people like you and I, can have different end motivations. Some maybe want to close that gap of only 1.3% of venture capital going to women-led companies. Others may be interested in investing for things like women's health or men's health, right? But having that intentional design. And then others yet may just be looking for performance opportunities. Now, all of those objectives may result in different strategies, which is why that why is so important.
Yeah. And that makes sense. And as you're sort of thinking through the different objectives and outcomes that people can be looking towards, it reminds me a lot of the paper coming out of CIO last year on gender lens investment that really looked at these three different approaches to gender lens investing, right? So investing in women, investing by women, and investing for women that you sort of touched on a little bit there earlier. But for those who may not be familiar with these different terms and concepts and approaches, I was wondering if you could maybe sort of break that down a little bit more a little bit more explicitly across those different lines and sort of ways that people can be thinking around gender lens investing?
Yeah, of course. That CIO research report that came out in March of last year really put a framework to organize investors' thoughts around applying a gender lens to their investments. So investing for women really implies investing in those products or services that can help either close gaps that women face broadly and globally, or enable women to close those gaps. So think about investing with a focus on education, financial inclusion, or healthcare as examples here. Investing in women means literally investing in those women that are pursuing economic activity. So either those that are CEOs or otherwise leaders of businesses, or even you could think of investing in investment managers that are led by women, or those strategies that have female portfolio managers. And then investment by women is another lens you can apply really throughout. So that could mean asking and looking at what women who control capital do with their capital, be it personal investors or be it institutional investors. And you can look at downstream, are those female portfolio managers potentially, what are they doing? Where is this capital going? So all these three lenses were helpful for then this educational research and report to just go over and look at the data and what the data shows factually around what is happening.
Yeah. And once you've thought through the different approaches and sort of figured out what it is exactly that you want to focus on, what you want to achieve, it sounds like the next step is then going to be looking at the investable universe, right? And figuring out what are then sort of the products and strategies that I then want to use, right, to build this portfolio to help achieve, sort of the outcomes that I'm looking for. I think it'd be helpful maybe even just to talk a little bit more about what that actual investable universe looks like. Where are there opportunities? Where might there be gaps? And perhaps we could even start with private markets. I know we often get a lot of questions from our clients in that area.
Yeah, of course. And this is a good as any stopping point to really say that the goal of this report was really to pull together data, various data sources, and look at the investable universe across the world. But whether these investment strategies will be appropriate for any given investor will very much depend on their specific situation. This is, in fact, the whole point here when talking about the why, right? Now, we looked at data from PitchBook, a data provider in the private market space, and we identified those investment strategies that have female senior decision makers, so either managing partners or chief investment officers, because we wanted to look and answer the question, like, what does this actually mean if I want to support these women? This was a global data set, and what we found, and you can see on the chart, is that you have a universe of some, a couple thousand, going on 3,000 total investment strategies that have a woman as a senior decision maker. However, if you look more broadly within the asset classes, you'll see a larger number of these are in the early stage venture capital. And a lot of those strategies you see on the AUM, assets under management, on the left-hand side of the chart, tend to be smaller funds in terms of total assets. This doesn't necessarily have to do anything with who is leading those strategies. It may have to do with just the early nature stage of venture capital as a sub-asset class. And so it's interesting to look at this chart. I think to me, it says that yes, there are plenty of investment options, but depending on where you as an individual may be interested in allocating, like you'll find more or less options. And so it's really important, again, to be precise about the role that any idea would have in your personal objectives.
And then one of the objectives that you mentioned earlier was on performance, right? You may have investors who are interested in just thinking, what does performance look like across these different types of strategies? Could you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in that private market space from a performance standpoint?
Yeah, very interesting question. We just looked at the same investment universe. We narrowed it down by those strategies where we had performance data from PitchBook. And essentially what we found is that across all the asset classes, more or less, female-led managers tended to perform in a similar way to the broader peer group in the asset class. So there were, about half of these strategies were in the top half of performance. Half of them were in the bottom half of performance on average across the board, which meant that really there's no trade-off here, at least in private markets.
Yeah, and then in public markets, right? I'd be interested to sort of get your thoughts on what you saw in the public market space in terms of just availability of strategies, whether there's any sort of focus or sort of niches there?
Yeah, of course. We were able to do two different things here with public markets data from Morningstar. We looked at the investment universe that has a specific focus on women. So think of that investment for women. There we found a range of different strategies, from those that have a focus on funding or investing in public market companies that have better social inclusion policies. So not just women on the board, but also looking at workforce management and human capital, to the strategies that are looking to fill more of those gaps. So strategies which have a focus on healthcare or social inclusion otherwise. So that was one way. Then the second way, we did the same thing as with private markets. We looked at where available data existed, the universe of strategies that had at least one woman as part of the portfolio management. And again, this was restricted to where data was available from Morningstar, but very interesting to see both of those data sets.
Absolutely. Those sound like a really interesting sets of data to look at and compare, and to also think conjunction with sort of private markets. But sort of even just staying on the public market side, I'd be interested as to what you saw from performance there.
Yeah, of course. So the performance slightly differed depending on the two universes that I discussed. In the broader set of strategies where there is at least one female PM, at least in the data available, we saw the same thing as we did with private markets. On the chart, what you're seeing is that essentially for strategies domiciled in Asia, in Europe, and in North America, about the same thing happened. Half of the managers on average were basically at the like 50th percentile, so performing around average, which means you shouldn't have a distinction systematically around performance. It also means, in both cases, that you may find performance differences on the edges, right? So here is where really this is just education, and when it comes to portfolio construction, you need to be really careful and thoughtful about what is going in and if it's meeting an individual's objectives.
Absolutely. I think that's really helpful as people are thinking around building this diversified portfolio, right? You'll want to think through what are the different options that are available, what might be different tilts, how does that impact from a region or a sector basis. And it sounds like it'll be really important for investors to really discuss with their advisors on how they want to think around building these portfolios going forward.
Yeah, and again, I think really for the goal here was to help draw together all of these questions into one cohesive framework that looks at the why, starting there, but then also examines the how based on what the data tells us. And hopefully it can be a good read for Women's History Month.
Absolutely. Well, we look forward to reading it, and we'll be sure to share it. And please reach out to your advisor if you're looking for more information.